Going back to lockdown 2 years ago, remember how everybody took up all sorts of new hobbies and taught themselves new skills? They learned to crochet sourdough or run marathons on the patio, all that kind of thing. Well, my version of doing that was reading about the history of pandemics and producing the book that should be appearing. There it is. It's the book that Joan mentioned. I chose 20 pandemics over the last 2,500 years: plague, smallpox, cholera, syphilis, leprosy, flu, you name it. And I used the incredible archive resources that are available online to find out what people at the time said about what they were going through. It was gruesome at times. It gave me nightmares, to be honest, but it was also fascinating. The fact I was able to do it so easily from the comfort of my own home, mostly using an extraordinary website called archive.org, which has got millions and millions of books digitized on it, shows how in some ways we were pretty fortunate. Just suppose COVID had happened 20 years ago, the year 2000, 2002. There wouldn't have been any social media, so people would have got their news from the mainstream media. There'd have been no online groceries. There'd have been no Zoom, so no working from home, no U3A, no online schooling, no exercise classes, social groups, or family meetups. Just months and months of real isolation and boredom. There'd have been no phone apps, so no big real-time data is less comprehensive and less granular. The governments wouldn't have known what was going on. Communication between world scientists would mostly be done by email, so analysis of the virus's genetic code would take longer and the vaccine would have been slower to be developed. Frustrations would have built, and more people, perhaps far more people, would have died. The amazing science, the technology, and the collaboration may be new, but the experience of living through a pandemic, the disruption, fears, the public health strategies that were used for COVID, they've barely changed for centuries. Most of them would have been familiar to people at the time of the Black Death. So too the fear, the quack remedies, the fake news, and the conspiracy theories. Many people who lived through earlier pandemics wrote about what they saw and what they felt and what they did. Their words are a helpful perspective to us to make sense of what's happened and what we've experienced in the last couple of years. 2 years ago, if you were reading about the pandemics of the past, it was like visiting an unfamiliar world. We knew the accounts of Samuel Pepys and Daniel Defoe about London's plague year, but they were remote from our experiences. They were strange. But today, surely every one of us knows exactly what Pepys was feeling on the 20th of September, 1665. That evening, he wrote, "Lord, what a sad time it is to see no boats upon the river. The grass grows all up and down Whitehall Court. Nobody but poor wretches in the street. And what's worst of all, the Duke showed us the number of the plague last week. It's increased by about 600 more than the previous, which is quite contrary to our expectations and hopes from the coldness of the late season." We all know a bit about the Great Plague, partly because Pepys and Defoe wrote so well about it, but many other pandemics have had a much less high-profile press at the time and since. The deadliest pandemic of modern times caused maybe 50 million deaths worldwide, which is almost 10 times as many as COVID has done. Yet, it coincided with the final weeks of the First World War, and it struck households which had already lost sons, husbands, lovers, brothers to the fighting. And the so-called Spanish flu pandemic took place mostly behind closed doors. The press was restrained. Politicians took little note. Parliament didn't mention it at all for the first 3 months of the epidemic. The cabinet wasn't interested. Workplaces, towns remained busy, and the whole pandemic was soon little more than a sad footnote to the more public tragedy of the war a footnote that was made flesh in Paris on the 13th of November, 1918, 2 days after the armistice, at the funeral of the avant-garde poet Guillaume Apollinaire. This funeral was attended by many cultural giants, including Picasso. A friend of Apollinaire's, called Blaise Cendrars, wrote this. He said, "The casket left the church draped in a flag. Guillaume's lieutenant's helmet was on it among the wreaths and the flowers. A guard of honor led the slow convoy. But as we reached the corner of Saint-Germain, the cortege was besieged by a crowd of noisy celebrants of the armistice, men, women, with arms waving, singing, dancing, kissing, shouting deliriously. Paris was celebrating. Apollinaire was lost. I was full of melancholy. It was absurd." At the time, no one knew that Spanish flu was caused by a virus, but they did know that it was the world in which people moved around at speed and mixed in close proximity. It was incubated in military camps, and it had a lot in common with the war itself. There was a lot people didn't know: what caused it, how to treat it, how to slow its spread. But they also learned that it was something, that a pandemic was part of life, something that authorities could and should be planning for. And this is what the American public health specialist George Price meant in December 1918, when he called the Spanish flu both a destroyer and a teacher. I think this phrase is really useful for many pandemics. The following year, his colleague George Soper wrote, "The most astonishing thing about this pandemic was the complete mystery that surrounds it. Nobody seemed to know what the disease was, where it came from, or how to stop it. Anxious minds today are inquiring whether another wave will come again." In the 100 years since he wrote that, most of the mystery has been removed. Pathogens, their genetic structure, their life cycle are now understood in incredible detail. Drugs, antibiotics, antivirals, vaccines, treatments have developed with astonishing speed, and international cooperation in public health has brought real triumphs. Smallpox has been eradicated in the wild, and polio almost so. So much has happened in that 100 years that 50 years ago, 1972, Australian Nobel-winning virologist Macfarlane Burnet argued that the likely future of infectious diseases, the study of infectious diseases, would be, quote, "very dull." There might, he said, be some wholly unexpected emergence of a new and dangerous infectious disease, but nothing of that sort has marked the last 50 years. I'm afraid he was wrong. In the half-century following his remarks, has seen many more and more diverse pandemics than ever before, and they're all from new pathogens. From HIV to Ebola, mad cow disease to Zika, Legionnaire's disease to COVID-19, the array of deadly novel pathogens has just grown. And we are forced to take more and more action against them. Cast your mind back to the late 1960s, when Hong Kong flu killed 4 million people, almost as many as COVID has done today. Yet nowhere were citizens locked indoors for weeks on end. Today's baby boomers who as kids suffered infection, quite possibly several of you, many of you look back with amazement and even pride at the lack of measures to control infection. One sufferer, for example, then aged 11, was at school. He said, "Half the teaching staff were victims, the timetable collapsed, but we spent our time in mixed classrooms supervised by random teachers. We were just told to read and wait for the symptoms." In 2020, only extreme COVID skeptics advocated that sort of approach. The difference between then and now is not in the virulence of the pathogen, but in the complexity of our world, which has become so tightly integrated, so dependent on ceaseless movement of goods and people. Pandemics have happened ever since people began to crowd together in cities and to move across the earth in large numbers. Even though scientists today know so much more than they did in 1918 or even 1969, a popular understanding of why a pandemic begins and spreads, why it hits some individuals at a particular time and not others, that's been much slower to move on. The popular response says a lot about society. Just like this picture of Hong Kong flu, COVID has been blamed on outsiders, especially the Chinese, for their lack of hygiene, their carelessness, or worse. Others, of course, have claimed that the race for a vaccine was really an attempt by billionaires to microchip us all, or by Big Pharma to make unprecedented profits. At the time of the Black Death, people were deeply disturbed by this invisible enemy that suddenly appeared and struck down loved ones, and some of our loved ones and not others, apparently at random. It was blamed on hated outsiders too, especially on the Jews, who suffered grievously. There's a picture on the bottom right of a pogrom, early pogroms. And it was explained as God's anger at society's carnal excesses. Some people tried to allay that anger by public flagellation, which is what they're doing in the top left. Others doubled down by having as many parties as they could. I know a bit about that too. At the time, the Florentine poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote the Decameron. This was a set of stories that was purportedly told to pass the time by a group of wealthy young Florentines who had escaped the city to avoid the plague. He also, in his introduction to those stories, provided a lengthy account of the impact of the plague. He said, "Some people tried to avoid the illness by moderate living, shutting themselves in their houses where no one had been sick, taking nothing but good food and good wine, trying not to listen to the news, but busying themselves with music and other pleasures. But other people thought boozing, singing, laughing were the best medicine. They went from tavern to tavern drinking, having fun. This was all the easier because many people had abandoned their homes and their possessions, so their houses had become common property, where complete strangers could just go in and make use of whatever they contained. Most of the poor, however, stayed at home. They fell sick by the thousand every day. And with no one to care for them, many people died in the street, while those who died in their homes were found only by the stench of the decomposing bodies. Nor were the dead honored with tears, flames, or companions. Human bodies were disposed of, much as we would now get rid of a dead goat." And for his contemporary, the poet Petrarch, he's interesting. He lost his beloved muse, Laura, to the Black Death. There she is on the left. And his brother, who was a monk, was the sole member of his entire monastery to survive the disease. And Petrarch wrote a letter to his brother. He said, "My dear brother, what can I say? Where shall I turn? On all sides there's sorrow, everywhere there's fear. How will posterity believe that there could ever have been a time like this when, with no war, with no thunderbolts from heaven or fires on earth, almost the whole world has been left uninhabited? Has such a thing ever been seen before? Which annals relate? Houses left empty, cities deserted, countryside neglected, burial grounds too small for the dead, and a loneliness over the whole earth. People in the future who have not experienced these miseries will be fortunate indeed. Perhaps they'll imagine that we've just made it all up." Excuse me. Since ancient time, physicians have described their understanding of the disease and the cure, and survivors have written about the nightmare of having a long-feared disease entering your own home or your own body. If you were truly blessed, you might get assistance from the gods. A Greek orator called Aelius Aristides did when he was struck down by a mysterious pandemic, perhaps smallpox, in AD 165. And after it, he wrote this: I felt my life slipping away. I turned my face to the wall, and it seemed it was the end. But Asclepius, the god of healing, suddenly turned me over again. And then Athena herself appeared with her aegis, and the scent of her aegis was as sweet as could be, marvelous in its beauty and its magnitude. I pointed out to my friends and my sister who were with me, and I named her Athena. They thought I'd become delirious, but they saw my strength was restored, and they heard the words which she'd spoken. The goddess consoled me and saved me when I was on my sick bed. Some people tried to profit from this pandemic in the 160s. The Roman satirist called Lucian reported that a man called Alexander of Aboniticus, which is somewhere in Turkey, made a fortune by selling magic charms. Alexander sent oracle mongers all across the empire, warning cities to be on their guard against plagues and conflagrations and earthquakes, and promising to help avert these calamities. During the pandemic, he sent one oracle to all the nations. It was just a single line of verse. It was, Phoebus, the unshorn god, keeps off the nebulous onset of the plague. And Lucian says, this verse could be seen written over doorways everywhere as a charm against the pestilence, but in most cases it had quite the opposite result. For some reason, the houses on which the verse was inscribed suffered the worst. I don't mean they were stricken because of the verse, but that's what happened. Perhaps the residents neglected their usual precautions because of their confidence in the oracle. They just trusted the syllables to defend them, and the unshorn Phoebus to drive the plague away. And indeed, a piece of pottery inscribed with this very line has been found on the Thames foreshore in London. Another person to benefit from more efficacious divine assistance was Margaret, the daughter of English statesman and Saint Thomas More. In this picture, More is sitting in the middle, Margaret sitting on the floor on the right. In 1528, she was struck down by the mysterious disease sweating sickness, a disease that normally brought death in 24 hours. If you've read or seen Wolf Hall, you may remember that Cromwell's wife and children were suddenly died within a day, and they had this disease. More commented about this disease. It was also called the English sweat because it seemed to be exclusive really to English people, and even foreigners living in London were thought not to get it. He said it was safer to be on a battlefield than in the city. So Margaret got it, and this account of her recovery was written by her husband. In his chapel, on his knees with tears, her father, Thomas, besought Almighty God if it was his blessed will to vouchsafe to hear his humble petition. Whereupon, unexpected came into his mind that a glister, which is an enema, should be the best way to help her. When he told the physicians, they confessed that if there were any hope of health, then this was the very best help indeed. They much marveled indeed that they hadn't thought of it themselves. So it was immediately administered to her while she slept. Contrary to all their expectations, she was, by her father's most fervent prayers, miraculously recovered, and at length the perfect health restored. Some people thought that earthly authorities should have a role in alleviating the effects of a pandemic to support the Almighty. One such event was the sudden arrival of virulent syphilis in Europe in the 1490s. And in its extreme form, the pandemic went on for about 40 years before it became more mild. In 1530, the year after Thomas More's prayers had helped cure his daughter, his friend Erasmus wrote a dialogue in which two men described the tragedy of a young and innocent girl being married to a pox-ridden lecher against her will. And they debated what, if anything, the powers that be should do in response to this new threat to the social order. One of them says, "It's a wonder to me that princes, whose business it is to take care of the Commonwealth, should find no remedy for the evil of the pox. This terrible pestilence has infected the great part of the earth, yet they lie snoring. They pay no attention, as if it's not worthy of their attention." His solution, this is the person in the dialogue, I don't think Erasmus's, was somewhat extreme: to arrest anyone who caught the disease and burn them at the stake before they could spread it. But state or city governments have often been at a loss in the face of deadly epidemics. Rulers have often kept their heads down, knowing that they easily could lose more than they could gain. Thus, when Henry VIII, on his way to visit Anne Boleyn in 1528, heard that she'd tested positive for the sweating sickness, he just turned his horse straight round and went back home. But sometimes the princes and rulers did what they could. In the case of syphilis, they tended, of course, to blame the morals of the women and not the men. And they tried, and they usually failed, to close down the brothels. 1,000 years earlier, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, who himself was a survivor of the plague, paid for the burial of victims whose bodies would otherwise have rotted in the street. The Black Death and its aftermath marked a step forward in public health experimentation. In 1348, the Muslim governor of Damascus ordered a public fast and a huge multi-faith service that was credited with slashing plague infection rates, involved Muslims and Christians and Jews. In Cairo, by contrast, the governor simply banned women from leaving their homes, though this order was quickly rescinded when traders saw their business disappear. Venice introduced quarantine, 40 giorni, 40 days, for visiting ships. And in going back to the Great Plague in 1665, the Mayor of London ordered complicated rules, including self-isolation, social distancing, reporting cases, hygiene measures in shops, closing inns and entertainment venues, and all sorts of other practices with which we are now wearily familiar. But even recently, heads of government have been often unwilling to get involved, as they've had to with COVID. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, fearing an evangelical backlash, refused to take action on the spread of AIDS. And for the same disease, South African President Thabo Mbeki saw it as the product of colonialism rather than as a public health issue. In 2002, he argued that for centuries, we, Africans, have carried the burden of the crimes and falsities of scientific Eurocentrism. Its dogmas have been imposed on us as the definitive universal truth. And against this, we have made the statement, to which we will remain loyal, that we are human and African. Because we're human, we shall no longer permit control by a colonial mother who claims for herself the right unceasingly to restrain us from reclaiming our dignity. Not only did he refuse that, he refused to sanction the use of retroviral drugs, even for pregnant women, something that is thought to have resulted in 300,000 preventable deaths. One of the first pandemics to be described in detail, though sadly not enough detail for the pathogen to be identified, was a plague in Athens in 430 BC, at the beginning of the war between Athens and Sparta. And the historian Thucydides not only was there, but he survived the disease. He wrote a detailed and clear headed account, which begins with the Athenians watching the sickness gradually approaching from Egypt. And he described the symptoms he himself endured, the shocking sights, and the moral decline that resulted. But he found no sign of divine involvement in human affairs. In fact, he said the physicians were of little use, as they were ignorant of the proper way to treat it. But no other art fared any better. Supplications to the gods, divinations in the temples were equally futile. In the end, the overwhelming nature of the disaster put a stop to these practices altogether. As I said before, the Christian world often saw pandemics as an act of God, whether as teaching or punishment or both. So in the 540s AD, in the so-called plague of Justinian, which I mentioned earlier, which actually seems to have been the first visitation of bubonic plague in the West and may have killed tens of millions itself, the cleric John of Ephesus described the usual awful scenes, saying, evening after evening, we used to think that death would come to us in the night. When we woke next morning, we would face the grave the whole day as we looked at wailing villages and at corpses lying on the ground with no one to gather them. But he concluded, when this chastisement came upon Byzantium, the abundant goodness of God came with it. Although the chastisement was very frightening and severe, we should see it not only as a sign of wrath, but also a sign of grace and a call to repentance. As a king warns his enemies, I'm coming, get ready or it'll be too late for you. So this scourge sent its messages from city to city, as if to say, repent, I am coming. I shall make your riches worthless. 1,000 years later, Martin Luther took the idea of a pandemic as the sign of God's grace one step further when he was asked if a Christian could justifiably flee an outbreak of plague in his city. He replied, think about this. If Christ had been laid low by illness, everyone would have been concerned. No one would have fled. And yet people don't think what Christ meant when he said, inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, ye have done it unto me. If you refuse to serve your neighbor now, you can be sure that if Christ were laying there, you would let him die too. But he concluded, use medicine, take potions, fumigate your house, your garden, your street, shun people and places, unless your neighbor needs you. Act as a man who wants to help put out a burning city. For the epidemic's like a fire, and instead of using burning wood and straw, it devours life and body. Think of it like this. By God's decree, the enemy has sent us poison, deadly offal. So I'll ask God to protect us. I'll purify the air. I'll give medicine to others. Take it myself. If God wishes to take me, he'll find me. And I won't be responsible either for my own death or for anybody else's. If my neighbor needs me, I'll go to him freely. This is a truly God-fearing faith. Not brash, not foolhardy, and it does not tempt God. Pandemics often result when a population is exposed to a pathogen that is endemic in some other part of the world. That means that very often in the past, pandemics have been a byproduct of war, just as the Spanish flu was, where probably it came from China and was brought to Europe and America by laborers who were brought to dig trenches. The histories of war and disease have long been intertwined. The Antonine plague, that's the one of 150, which I mentioned earlier, which Aeneas Aristides. The Antonine plague, the Romans believed that their armies had brought it back from Mesopotamia when they sacked a temple of Apollo. Syphilis, as I mentioned, it was known in Renaissance times as the French disease or the Neapolitan disease, because those two countries were fighting the Italian wars, and you named it whatever side you weren't on. If you supported the French, you called it Neapolitan. If you supported the Neapolitans, you called it French. Typhus. It proved deadly during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, the American Civil War, other wars, and of course in the Nazi concentration camps as well. And today, the threat of deadly pathogens being used as biological weapons haunts our nightmare. Imperial expansion in particular has been disastrously linked with the spread of pandemic disease. Bubonic plague was spread across Asia and brought to Europe by marauding Mongols who brought it from China. Cholera, which had long been endemic in Bengal, only became a global killer when the British Army encountered it in the 1810s. The age of European expansion produced a catastrophic exchange of pathogens between the old world and the new. Smallpox and measles caused genocide among native populations such that many observers were appalled. It's thought that during the first century of European colonization, control in Mexico, in that first 100 years, 90% of the population died, most of them from smallpox and measles. Yellow fever was another one. That was a disease that originated in China, in Africa, and many enslaved African Americans suffered it when they were young. And then when they were brought across to America, they brought the pathogen with them. But because they'd had it when they were young, they were wrongly thought to be immune. And in 1793, the very early years of the United States, a serious outbreak hit the capital city, Philadelphia. And the mayor and the medical establishment urged the free Black community to volunteer to nurse their white fellow citizens and to bury the dead. 250 stepped up thinking they were immune. Most of them died. Of course, for most of history, physicians had to work in the dark. They were just guessing at the conditions in which the disease thrived. Their work was difficult and dangerous, even if it was misguided and ineffectual. Even when they did their best, patients often didn't trust them. In 1832, there was an outbreak of cholera in Liverpool. The Liverpudlians were conscious that a few years ago there'd been a scandal in Edinburgh where two men, Burke and Hare, were digging up cadavers of murder victims and selling them on to doctors for dissection. And the Liverpudlians simply rioted and attacked the hospitals, thinking the same thing was going on there. Like Lucian writing about Alexander, many people were angered by people who promoted cynical cures. Going back to 1665, the apothecary William Boghurst was scathing when the educated physicians mostly left London. They left, he said, the poor people prey to devouring blunt fellows who made sad work, both with the people's bodies and with their purses. They sold them idle medicines at an extraordinarily dear rate. One sold purging pills for ½ a crown a pill, an ointment at 5p an ounce. They also sold pomanders very dearly and plasters at 5 shillings a piece. I met one who bragged much of water he had. I asked him how the water would affect a cure, and he told me by purging and vomiting and bleeding all at the same time. Variolation, which is inoculation by prompting a mild outbreak under relatively controlled conditions, was used as a protection from smallpox from the 17th century. And it was controversial, just as the much safer vaccination developed by Edward Jenner down the road in Berkeley in the 1790s was throughout the 19th century. Vaccination, of course, became especially controversial when there was a law passed to insist on people having it, and the concept of conscientious objection had to be developed for people who didn't want to be vaccinated. But going back to the 1750s, one energetic proponent of variolation was Benjamin Franklin, the American scientist and statesman. He wrote, in 1736, I lost one of my sons. He was a fine boy, 4 years old, to the smallpox. I still regret I hadn't given it to him already by inoculation. I mention this for the sake of parents who omit that operation, supposing that they should never forgive themselves if the child died under it. My example shows that the regret may be the same either way, and therefore the safer course should be chosen. It feels very pertinent today when they're just making a decision about vaccinating very young children. It was only in the later 19th century that Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch proved that bacteria could cause diseases, and several more decades passed before the first virus pathogens were identified. Before that, some early adopters had proposed a germ theory of disease, what they called germ theory, but well into the 20th century, the idea persisted that epidemics were really the product of something more intangible, whether it was an imbalance in bodily humors or a rare conjunction of the planets, or a so-called miasma or bad air, like malaria in Italian. Polio was a deadly viral disease, especially in the early mid-20th century, but it was thought to be a disease of dirt and bad air. The terrified middle classes of the United States especially blamed it on the lack of hygiene amongst new immigrants, especially those Neapolitans again. The Neapolitans get a bad press in this. The virus was only isolated in 1931, and when Jonas Salk discovered a vaccine in 1955, he refused to patent it, saying, "Could you patent the sun?" The same sort of time as polio was coming into focus, track and trace. Remember track and trace? That was developed as a measure against the spread of a pandemic. In 1907, a young man called George Soper identified one famous super spreader in New York. I made an investigation into an outbreak of typhoid fever in a house which had been rented out for the summer. 6 of the 11 persons in that household were taken sick. Having inquired if there had been any carriers in the house before the outbreak occurred, I came through a process of exclusion to the cook. But where was she? She'd left 6 months ago. I tried to find out everything I could about her, but there wasn't much to learn. The other servants knew little. She was not particularly clean. Her name was Mary Mallon. That was about all. It was not at first clear how the family could have been infected from the cook, for where there are so many servants, there's little food that a cook handles that's not later heated to a temperature sufficient to make it harmless. However, one Sunday, Mary had prepared a dessert of ice cream with fresh peaches cut up in it. I suppose no better way could be found for a cook to cleanse her hands of microbes and infect the family. At length, I caught up with her. Mary was working as cook in a house on Park Avenue, New York. Smart address. I had my first talk with her in the kitchen of this house. I suppose it was an unusual interview. Mary was about 40 years of age. She was 5'6" tall, blonde with clear blue eyes, healthy color, and somewhat determined mouth and jaw. I was as diplomatic as I could be, but I had to say I suspected her of making people sick. and that I wanted her to give me specimens of her urine, her feces, and her blood. It did not take Mary long to react to this suggestion. She picked up a carving fork and advanced in my direction. I passed rapidly down the long, narrow hall through the tall iron gate and out of the sidewalk. I felt rather lucky to escape. Typhoid Mary herself, though, did not get off so lightly. She spent most of the remaining 30 years of her life in enforced quarantine. Masks. Masks were first used by doctors in the Black Death with long beaks that held herbs to protect the wearer. Gauze masks were introduced during the Spanish flu outbreak, and in some places they were made compulsory, including New South Wales, where the summer heat made them pretty uncomfortable. The Sydney Morning Herald reported, Sydney was officially supposed to be masked yesterday. Generally speaking, people responded cheerfully enough, but it was a very hot day, and as the hours passed, a very material section of the community who found it necessary to move about the streets were much less cheerful behind their masks. There is no doubt that one effect of wearing a mask on a person whose affairs involve much locomotion, it imposes a trying test upon both his temper and his endurance. After an hour or so, there is an overwhelming sense of partial suffocation, a feeling of intense heat, and an almost unconquerable yearning for surreptitious inhalations of atmosphere without the intervention of gauze. You're probably familiar with that one. Disease prevention through case tracing, immunization, and treatment was crucial during the Second World War among both military and civilian populations. In September 1943, after the Allies liberated Naples, the city faced a threat of a typhus epidemic. It had to be treated with DDT. They basically squirted it down your back of your neck, as in the photograph, up your sleeves and down your trousers. The Americans swung into action on tracking and tracing, though, with a speed that Dido Harding, I think, has not managed to match here. Dusting operations were instituted on the 15th of December. The team of workers dusted all the outbound passengers boarding a train for Bari. The following day, contact dusting teams were sent out to addresses of reported cases of typhus emanating from homes and institutions. Each team was instructed to report new or suspected cases. They discovered many new cases which had previously not been reported to civil health authorities. The importance of proper case finding was so apparent that a special case finding section was organized. By the 26th of December, just 11 days after the operations began, the typhus control program provided for 6 operational sections, including case finding, contact delousing, mass delousing, and immunization. Finally, pandemics have always challenged the imagination and our mental health. Extreme events of love and loss, sudden changes in the way that we live, urgent questions about the meaning and value of human life. These are the realm of the spirit as much as the laboratory and the government archive. New forms of expression are sometimes needed. 16th century scientist and physician Girolamo Fracastoro chose the forms of epic poetry to express the nightmarish impact of the new STD that his country was facing. He chose the story of a young shepherd in Arcadia named Syphilus, who cursed Apollo for sending a drought, and he was afflicted as punishment. By writing this poem, Fracastoro then thereby permanently named the disease. The horrors of mass death through disease were perhaps too squalid for many of the 19th century novelists, but more genteel suffering brought on by tuberculosis was the staple of 19th and early 20th century literature. In recent decades, creative writers have again found pandemic a topic that they can grapple with. Perhaps the godfather of this was Albert Camus, who wrote his unforgettable account of plague in one North African city. COVID has inspired all kinds of creative work, both written and visual. I think it may even become to be seen as the blogger's pandemic. In terms of the visual art, some of you may have enjoyed the Grayson's Perry's Art Club on TV. And if you did, or if you didn't, you may be interested that in the Bristol Museum, there's a current exhibition of much of the work, and it's highly recommended. So finally, I just want to say, the destroyer and teacher has done huge damage to us in the last 2 years. But I hope it's also taught us important things, including new ways of being in society, helped us find new forms to express them, and perhaps also to look back at the past with more understanding and more compassion. Thank you very much. Okay.